Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. On May 10, David Brooks wrote a much-discussed New York Times op-ed entitled Trump's Lizard Wisdom, in which he argued that Donald Trump's background of mobster associations in New York and Atlantic City grounded him admirably in a new foreign policy in which the Marquis of Queensberry rules were out the window and he could play hardball with the thug minds running parts of today's world. This bull in a china shop approach may have led us to a course change in our dealings with North Korea, China, Iran, Israel, and the Palestinians. With us to discuss the Trump national security policy is James Lindsay, who has just completed a book on that subject. Jim Lindsay is an old friend. He is a director of studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in the domestic politics of U.S. foreign policy. Jim, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the program.
It's great to be here, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Now, Brooks' piece begins by talking about Trump's dealing with the mob and the construction of Trump Tower in New York, his dealing with the mob in his Atlantic City casinos, and he says this is a great background for Trump's attitude toward foreign policy as President of the United States. Brooks says, and I quote, "There is growing reason to believe that Donald Trump understands the thug mind a whole lot better than the people who attended our prestigious foreign service academies," end quote. Now, is this nonsense, or do you think there's something to this?
Well, I'll leave it to David Brooks to do the psychoanalysis of the president and how he got to the views he did. What I would suggest is that there's an element of importance here in terms of how President Trump approaches foreign policy. Two things. One, he campaigned on the pledge to do different things in foreign policy and to do them differently. The second thing is that he very much does believe in power, the ability of the United States, being the most powerful country in the world, to essentially push others to give the United States what it wants. And his indictment of past presidents was that they didn't use American power sufficiently to protect American interests.
Well, because Madeleine Albright has said that foreign policy is supposed to get other countries to do what we want them to do. So there's nothing particularly new about this.
Well, but it's different in terms of form. Again, the Trump criticism of the practice of foreign policy by Democrats and by Republicans, important to emphasize this critique, always was bipartisan, was that presidents didn't flex their muscles. They had subscribed to globalism, this idea that it was important to cooperate with others. And he saw it, and he campaigned on this, the argument that our allies and our friends were using the cover of multilateralism to free ride on America's efforts and to pick our pockets on trade and other issues. Now, whether that indictment is accurate or not is a whole separate question, but that's how he viewed the world and continues to view the world.
Well, if there's any coherent thread to his foreign policy, it's to repeal, and not necessarily with replace, everything that Obama and his predecessors did.
Well, there is an element of repeal without replace in terms of the president's approach to foreign policy. And there clearly seems to be an element of trying to repeal what it is that Barack Obama did. Perhaps that's personal. But I think there's a big argument that, again, the way the president approaches the world, and he's been very consistent for more than 30 years in talking about how he thinks foreign policy should be conducted. Some fundamental disagreements with the president's approach. I think the real question to focus on is whether or not the president's approach to foreign policy, pushing others, disrupting the status quo, antagonizing friends and allies, is likely to be productive, not just in the short term in terms of producing wins, but in the long term in the sense of making Americans both more secure and more prosperous. On that question, I think there's a considerable doubt.
Well, we're certainly seeing a new process. Are we also seeing a new substance in Trump foreign policy?
Well, certainly, because the president's notion of looking at foreign policy, I think, is not to think the way traditional foreign policy experts or administration officials look at it, seeing the world in terms of friends and foes. I think President Trump, when he looks out at the world, sees competitors. And the sense is that the president, and he was quite explicit in this on the campaign trail, that the United States should forget about this talk of being the indispensable nation. The president's not interested in leadership. He's interested in winning. Winning implies losers, and again, he looks at it as in the past, Americans lost these competitions, and he intends to win. One of the question marks, of course, is what does it mean to win? And the president has been extraordinarily good politically at talking about wins, but avoiding defining exactly what it is he's going to do, thereby not really providing a standard to judge his actions.
Well, his history has been as a day trader. And in foreign policy, certainly the president has to look beyond today in terms of what his policy is set to accomplish. Is there anything that we call that strategy? Is there anything strategic about Trump's foreign policy that you see?
I think you have to look really hard to see what the strategy is. I mean, one of the basic pieces of advice...
Look hard, that means you're saying there's no strategy.
Well, it's not clear what the strategy is. And again, sort of the president's approach to this seems to violate one of the maxims of foreign policy, which is don't pick too many fights at once, that you have to acknowledge trade-offs. The president hasn't seemed to have done that. He seems to have picked fights on lots of issues with lots of people all at once. And the question is how these trade-offs are going to play themselves out. And the president has sort of thrown sort of doubt or question on his own approach by, in some sense, often taking steps and then seeming to take them back. We saw this just recently with his tweet about the Chinese telecom company ZTE, which the United States has essentially put out of business because of its violation of our trading sanctions on North Korea in Iran, and then all of a sudden the president tweets out that he's going to work with the Chinese to keep ZTE in business, and it sent a lot of people sort of wondering what was going on here. But I also,
so do you think in doing that, Xi Jinping sitting in China thinks, oh my gosh, the president of the United States is caving, he's a paper tiger?
Well, I think that obviously in China there's a lot of time being spent trying to figure out what the president's bottom line is. And it's not clear what the president's bottom line is.
They view him as a businessman. They feel he's negotiating, and you can't really rely on anything he says except going in position. Isn't that right?
Well, certainly in 2017, I think the convention of wisdom was that President Trump's bark was bigger than his bite, that he talked a tough game but didn't actually follow through. I think we've seen so far in 2018 the president following through on his threats, particularly on the trade front. The question, of course, is that once you make a threat, are you willing to actually follow that out? And right now, the jury is out, so to speak, in terms of how far the president's willing to go. Particularly on the trade front, you have this issue in which other countries have begun to retaliate against the United States or talk about retaliating, and that has alarmed people who are going to be hurt by it. It's no accident that the Chinese, in response to the president's tariff increases, said, we're going to stop buying soybeans from Iowa soybean farmers. We send 62% of our soybean exports to China. If you are an Iowa soybean farmer, that's a big problem.
Pork as well. Now, our ambassador to China is the former governor of Iowa.
Yep.
I mean,
Terry Branstad.
Terry Branstad, how does this sit with him?
I haven't discussed it with the governor, but obviously, if you spend any time in Iowa, and I was very fortunate to be out there a couple of weeks ago, they're very concerned because this affects their livelihood. And you see this, I think, particularly in terms of the Republican side of Congress, a lot of members very concerned that the president's policies on the trade front are actually going to endanger the jobs of their constituents. And this is part of the problem with trade wars. And the president tweeted out famously that trade wars were good and easy to win. The problem is there can be lots of casualties along the way.
Well, then he said it wasn't a trade war, it was a trade negotiation.
Well, and we may not get to a trade war, and certainly, you know, part of the message from the administration was we're going to go into negotiations. But here's the problem with that. By talking about how we think we can negotiate an end, you in some sense undermine your own negotiating strategy. If the Chinese decide that the president is not going to make good on his threats, then they're going to ask for a lot more, and the United States is going to get a lot less.
So this resonates with North Korea because he said, I think at a press conference, certainly at a meeting, that he was going to bring down fire and fury on North Korea. Became the title of a book. He went to the UN and he called him Rocket Man and
Little Rocket Man.
Little Rocket Man, and disparaged Kim Jong-un. And all of a sudden, this morphs into his willingness to meet with them, which is a major concession from the United States.
Certainly is.
Without, it would appear, adequate preparation. No meetings at the foreign minister level, at the finance minister level in preparation for the meeting. But he's hurling himself headlong to Singapore to talk to Kim Jong-un. Now, on the heels of his caving on ZTE, North Korea is saying, well, maybe the meeting isn't such a good idea, and and they've called off meetings at the summit before that were designed to achieve peace. So the question is, what is the policy? And what is the strategy?
There's a lot there. And I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that, if I can use a baseball metaphor, we're only in the third or fourth inning, and we're trying to sort of predict what's going to happen in the eighth and ninth. It is possible that the meetings with Kim will be canceled. It's possible that they will go on. I think there's sort of two big things to keep our eyes on here. One is, it's not clear why President Kim made the opening, agreed to meet with President Trump. I think the common telling here in the United States is that what happened was the president talked tough, and now President Kim is going to the table. Therefore, President Kim is going to the table because Donald Trump coerced him into going there.
That's the Trump narrative.
That's a Trump narrative, but you can see it in a lot of conversation in Washington, and certainly in the news media. But there's an alternative explanation, which is that Kim has planned this all along, that when he achieved what he called in November, after a successful intercontinental ballistic missile test, the completion of the state nuclear force, that he felt he was in a position of great bargaining leverage, and that he could afford the opening, and that he wasn't coerced to the bargaining table. He came there voluntarily, and he came there voluntarily either because he thinks he can get major concessions from the United States, whether it's simply a photo op with Donald Trump, and which would sort of convey the image that North Korea is an equal to the United States, or perhaps economic concessions. But there's also the potential that what Kim is trying to do is to split the United States from South Korea. Kim looks south, looks at Seoul, President Moon, left of center. Somebody's a big fan of the so-called sunshine or engagement policy with the North. And it's potential that Pyongyang sees an opportunity here to separate its neighbor from the South from its security guarantor, the United States. Which is the correct analysis here, the Trump narrative or this Kim narrative? We don't know. We're going to sort of have to wait to see the next installment and see how the meeting plays out.
But it was not only Kim seeking the meeting, but then he followed it up with, number one, the release of the hostages, a great victory for the United States, and certainly a peace offering. And that was followed by his announcement that he was dismantling a nuclear facility that he had. Now, it's possible that he feels so well tested out and so well prepared with his nuclear arsenal that this really didn't matter much. But certainly it has the optics and the appearance of a major concession, and that he really wants peace.
Well, as you know, in negotiation, it's possible to give concessions that aren't real concessions. And I think you have to be very careful here in looking at what North Korea did. On the issue of closing down the testing facility, there was a lot of speculation before that concession was announced that the last nuclear test had actually destroyed the test site. There was reporting that the mountain actually fell like 6 or 10 inches because of the magnitude of it. It may be that, in essence, what they were doing there is they were going to close it down anyway because they'd effectively ruined it. And this way they get the optic of a concession. Likewise, it's important to note that 2 of the 3 hostages that were released recently were taken during President Trump's presidency. An alternative read on those events is that President Kim was looking ahead to negotiations, took the hostages, took the Americans hostage, because then he could trade them back and appear to be making a concession. So is it a real concession, or is it a manufactured concession? I think people can argue it both ways.
Now, let's just move on to Iran. The president abrogated or canceled the deal with Iran made by the Obama administration. And Brooks sees that as another instance of taking on the thugs of the world. Iran's been a bad actor. It's been a bad actor in Yemen and in Syria and in Lebanon. And they've used their missiles, firing on Israeli targets. So Trump says, well, what's the point of having a deal with you guys? Do you think that makes any sense?
I think the president has taken a very high-risk approach here with the Iran nuclear deal. To be clear, what he has done is taken the United States out of it and said he is no longer going to waive U.S. sanctions on companies that do business with Iran. The deal itself still exists. It was not a bilateral deal between the United States and Iran. It involved the so-called P5+1, the permanent members of the UN Security Council. Think China, think Russia, think Britain and France, and Germany. So far, what we now I guess call the P4+1 has said they intend to continue with the deal. Now, as best I can...
Which means they'll trade with Iran. There's a removal of sanctions. So are we prepared to sanction our European allies for trading with Iran?
This is another one of the crises that the president has generated with his approach, because the Europeans say that they are going to try to keep the deal alive. They want to keep the deal alive because they think the alternative is a lot worse. And they would argue, and I would agree, that this is a case in which we've taken a potential crisis that might happen 10 or 15 years down the road and moved it up, and that's a very risky sort of thing. So I think one of the potential fallout, underscore potential, from the president's withdrawal is a major crisis in the transatlantic relationship. You may have seen that Der Spiegel, which is one of the most widely read publications in Europe, ran an editorial which said that it was time for Europe to resist America. Now, is this a temporary flare-up of temper? Perhaps, but it may sort of tip into a longer-term view in Europe of the United States. That would be a problem for America because Europeans are our closest trading partners, they're our closest security allies, and a rupture in the transatlantic relationship would have significant consequences for American prosperity and security.
So is your issue with Trump on the Iran deal one of process or one of substance?
Well, I'm critical of both the process and the substance. I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by the process. Certainly in terms of how this issue was decided internally, there was an absence of process. The president did not convene his senior national security advisors to actually work through what it is that the United States was doing, what the possible consequences were, what we would do if certain things happened in the future. That's particularly important because, and I think it's worth emphasizing, the Europeans took Donald Trump both literally and seriously on his threat to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. And again, step back. The president's argument was that it was not that Iran was violating the deal. His argument was this was not a good deal and we should have negotiated a better deal. In particular, so-called sunset provisions on the deal, that is 10 to 15 years down the road, some of these limits on the Iran program would go away. He also had concerns about other aspects in terms of how Iran behaved regionally and what Iran was doing in terms of testing ballistic missiles. Those things were outside the deal. The Europeans came back with some, I think, pretty far-reaching proposals on how to deal with the ballistic missile issue and how to deal with the issue of Iran's regional behavior. And we had the visit by President Macron, we had the visit by Chancellor Merkel, Boris Johnson, the foreign minister, came to Washington to make the case to the president. And it's not at all clear that the president gave it a fair and open hearing. And I think certainly the takeaway in Europe has been that the president had no intention of pursuing these negotiations. He wanted to upset the table. On the substance of it, the big question now is, again, high-risk move by the president, and the question is going to be, how does this play out? As best I can tell, the calculation the president's making is that the reimposition of U.S. sanctions will do one of two things. It will either drive the Iranian regime into the ground, because its economy is flailing and you'll see an uprising, or second, it will force the Iranians to come to the negotiation table and renegotiate and give the president a better deal. Those are both possible things, but I think the probability of them succeeding is relatively low.
And if he's miscalculated, Iran might ramp up its nuclear capability, and if North Korea backs out, we have two potential nuclear crises confronting us at the same time.
You're exactly right. I mean, and this is why I would say this is a high-risk strategy, which has a fairly high chance of not working. And then you get back to this issue where we have multiple crises brewing all at the same time. That's a particular challenge. I think in many ways looking at this, I would emphasize the Iran issue the nuclear part of the Iran issue could have been postponed to the future. We're in some sense moving it up voluntarily, and that gets back to this issue of the president sort of choosing to have lots of foreign policy fights on lots of issues with lots of people all at the same time.
And this creating problems of our own making, right?
Creating problems of our own making, but also just think of the trade-offs, okay? Because we're going to the Chinese and saying to them on trade, we want this from you, but oh, by the way, we also want you to help us on Korea, and we're going to leave the Iran nuclear deal. China's a signatory to that deal and believes it should stand. So we are sort of making competing asks of the Chinese, and the question is, which do we value more? And again, the president is sort of asking for everything, and it is very rare in world politics that you get everything. And generally speaking, your geopolitical competitors, think the Russians, think the Chinese, don't do their rivals favors. And I don't think the president can expect any favors either from Beijing or from Moscow.
And what does it do to our credibility with China? I think you've put your finger on it, or North Korea, that we've pulled out of the Iran deal. And then we can easily morph from that into the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem as to what it does to our credibility as an honest broker with the Palestinians.
I don't think leaving the Iran deal hurts the president's negotiating position with the North Koreans, and it may to some extent enhance it. I would expect, I mean, the argument the administration would make is that the problem with the Iran deal wasn't that it was a deal for the United States, it was a bad deal. Donald Trump only makes good deals. You, North Korea, are making a deal with me. I'll make a good deal. It will stick here in the United States. So I don't think that's a real problem. I know it gets a lot of attention. I wouldn't worry about it particularly. I think, you know, in negotiations, we talk a lot about credibility, and people are always trying to grasp as to what determines credibility. I think in most of these negotiations, what really matters are interests and perception of what the other side has at stake. I think the North Koreans are under no misimpression or misunderstanding about the U.S. stakes in the Korean Peninsula. I think what they're trying to do is drive right now a wedge between the United States and our South Korean allies.
Let's talk about Jerusalem, if we may. We've stated many, many times over many presidents and many years that our Jerusalem was the capital of Israel and we were going to move our embassy there, but no president did it until now.
Yes, we even had a law. Congress passed a law which gave the president...
Congress passed a law, that's right.
And all presidents had waived it, saying, well, another 6 months we'll consider it.
Right. So Trump has now done it. Perhaps he did it at an opportune time, and maybe it triggered these riots that we see in Gaza and the violence and the 50 or so people who've been sadly killed. And maybe it didn't. Maybe it would have happened anyway. Maybe Iran stirred it up. But what do you make of all this as a tool of policy?
Well, I think the thing that to keep your mind on in terms of the Jerusalem issue would be twofold. One, the president traded something for nothing. And secondly, for all the talk of the administration early on about tackling the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and that would be the deal of a lifetime, the administration has done actually very little to move the ball forward on that process. And I think certainly from,
he's put his son-in-law in charge of the whole thing.
Well, I mean, from the Palestinian
and his bankruptcy lawyer is sent as ambassador.
And I think, you know, the way it's been read on the Palestinian side is that what has happened is they feel that they're being abandoned, that the United States no longer is an honest broker. And getting back to your point about the violence that's broken out in Gaza in the last couple of weeks, I think it's important to keep in mind that that's actually sort of working against one of the very interesting trends in the region, which has been this rapprochement between the Gulf Arab countries and Israel, uniting them based on their mutual opposition to Iran. And I think that's going to make it very difficult for leaders in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, to continue this sort of quiet movement toward a reconciliation with the Israelis. So there are lots of consequences from these events.
So I think you would agree that Trump, in all of these actions, China, North Korea, possibly a trade war with China, North Korea, Iran, and Jerusalem, has challenged the world order, and particularly our relationship with our allies. Do you think he's also upset the apple cart? I mean, has he put us into a very dangerous situation?
Again, I would say the president is doing things very differently. It's a high-risk gamble. intensified by the fact that he's upsetting lots of things at the same time. And we're going to see in the coming months, because I don't think the president's going to change his approach, whether other countries are going to buckle under. That's what President Trump certainly hopes for. Or they're going to go around America or resist America. That's the big question.
So unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I have a question for you,
okay.
Jim Lindsay. And my question is, to use David Brooks' phrase, is there a lizard wisdom to Trump's foreign policy?
I don't know really what lizard wisdom entails. I will simply say there is a logic behind what the president is trying to do. I think it is a logic that American foreign policy for the last 70 years tried to avoid, because we believe that we were stronger working through allies. I think the president's deeply skeptical. He's not interested in leading. He's interested in winning. So far, very few wins put on the table. Interested in winning, but few wins. Jim Lindsay, thanks so much for coming by. This has been absolutely marvelous. Thank you. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.